So first let me talk a little bit about the history of web forms so we know where we came from, so we can know where we're going. In the early 90s, when HTML forms were introduced, they looked a little bit like they do now. You've got your form tag and you've got your inputs. And when you click submit, the entire control of the browser went to the server, and the server was in charge of evaluating your submission, and if it was correct, then forwarding you on to wherever you needed to go. And if it was incorrect, it had to re-render the entire HTML page to display the errors. And there was no client-side validation. It couldn't tell you errors as you were going through the form. If you clicked submit twice, then the server had to deal with that. It was okay, but things got better, thankfully. And around the turn of the millennium, JavaScript came to forms. And this was the first time that on the client side you could modify form values and read form values. But the syntax was really terrible with document.forms of 0.username.value. And with a select, you had to look at the options array and get the selected index and then read the value on that. And radio buttons were even worse with you had to use a for loop to figure out which one was even selected. So there was a real appetite for JavaScript libraries that could simplify this to help both read form values and also modify the DOM. And long story short, as you know, the clear winner in that battle was jQuery. And also around the same time, another huge revolution came to HTML forms, and that was Ajax. And Ajax allowed you to submit the form in the background without having to refresh the whole page and not give control away back to the server. And you could submit only the form data and get back only the errors or the success, and there was a lot more control in the browser for what you were doing. And so this is what a jQuery code might look like for the HTML form that I showed earlier. Now, you didn't write forms in jQuery. jQuery was a set of listeners that you put on top of existing HTML. But it allowed for lots of things like listening for submit, and when submit was called, to go and look at the form values in each of your form inputs and submit that data asynchronously with JavaScript. And then if there was a problem, then you could display an error by showing or hiding divs or something. And this was a lot better because you didn't lose your control, and the JavaScript was in charge of showing errors and things. And you could even do client-side validation, where as you went through the form, you could display errors. However, the important thing is that we're still reading the form values from the DOM inputs themselves. When you click submit, you have to go and ask each DOM input, what is your current value? And you take that and you submit it. So the form state was still entirely in the DOM. But what do I mean by form state? Well, form state is several things. First of all, it's what are the values of each of the fields of each field in the form. It's which fields are even in the form. Are your field values valid? If there's one that's required that's not filled out, then you need to know about that. Which form elements has the user touched? Has the user tabbed through your form? Because that helps in displaying errors. Like, you don't want to display an error unless your user has been there and passed it and needs to be reminded that they made a mistake. Which field is currently active? Perhaps you want to display a little tooltip next to an input and to give more information about what they need to fill out. Have the values changed from their original values? If you've loaded a record from the database, then it's important to know if the user has modified that, because then you know whether you need to save it or not. And the industry term for this is dirty or pristine. Your value is dirty if it's changed from when it was loaded from the database, and is pristine if it hasn't. Is there some sort of asynchronous validation occurring at the moment? Like maybe you filled out your username in your sign-up form, and before the user even gets all the way down to the submit button, you want to go and check to see if that username is even valid to give them feedback before they even submit. And you need to show a little spinner maybe to explain that something is going on. And also, is the form itself being submitted? Because with Ajax, before Ajax, when you click submit, the whole browser sort of spun, and users were used to knowing that the browser was doing something. But with Ajax, you have to show a little spinner. And so when I say that with the jQuery example we just saw, that all the form state was in the DOM elements, I'm really only referring to the very first item here. All the rest of it wasn't even covered in that example. So all the rest of it would have to be rigged up with some sort of finite state machine via listeners on all the form elements. And if you've ever done this in jQuery, then you know that that can be quite a nightmare. So where did we go from here? Well, next came along something called TwoWay Databinding. And this was an important step in abstracting the form data away from the DOM elements and into JavaScript. And this came with libraries like Ember and Angular. Personally, I've only used Angular, so that's what I'll describe here. And it was done by putting an ng model attribute on your inputs. And then Angular was in charge of making sure that your values in your input were kept in sync with some JavaScript object in your scope. I won't go into what all that means, but you could finally reason about your form values as if they were in JavaScript only. However, this was a little bit ambiguous as to which the JavaScript or the DOM was the real authority on where your form values were, who held the canonical values. But for sure, it was a lot better than the document.forms of 0.radiobuttons. Whatever that we had before. But can we do better? Well, then came a little library you might have heard of called React. And React has a lot of momentum at the moment, and for good reason. The important thing about React is not so much the virtual DOM that made it famous at the beginning, but the concept of a declarative UI, that you are not in charge of changing the UI when something happens. You are in charge of taking state and rendering what the UI needs to be given that state. And you don't have to worry about showing or hiding divs or anything. And with this comes the concept of a one-way data flow, where rather than a two-way binding as before, the data really only comes down, and the changes go back up with events. And this makes your app a lot easier to reason about. So let's look at how React relates to forms. So forms in React, like most decent JavaScript libraries, React handles the little idiosyncrasies of reading values from the DOM inputs, because all the different inputs, for historical reasons, give the values a little bit differently, and React sort of smooths all that over. Likewise, with events, different browsers have slightly differently shaped events, and React wraps all of those in a synthetic event, so you have the same API for all your events. And similarly, your onChange is a little bit different in some of the DOM inputs, and it makes that all the same. But most importantly, React introduced the concept of controlled inputs. Now, what's a controlled input? A controlled input is an input that will always render the value that is given to it as a prop. So a prop in React terminology is like the attribute here, the value. So this input here, no matter what you type into the input, no matter how hard you bang on the keyboard, it will always render what is in the username as the value. So you might wonder, why would I want an input that I can't even change the value of? That doesn't make any sense. And the answer is that it takes control further away from the DOM. And this is hugely important because there's no more ambiguity as to who has the canonical version of the data. It's the JavaScript has the data. And you know that whatever is in the JavaScript is absolutely what is in your input. However, this does mean that you, as the developer, are in charge of mutating the form state and re-rendering the input. So let's see what that looks like. This is the simplest possible React form that I could come up with. It's got a username and a password. And let's look at it piece by piece. So at the top, we have our constructor. And the most important part of the constructor is the initialization of the state. This tells React that this is going to be a stateful component and that it needs to keep track of its state. Next, we bind our events listeners to this so that when we pass them as functions, they have a reference, the proper reference to this. Next, we have our event listeners themselves. First, we have the onChange listeners, and these get passed an event, and they get passed the new value of the input is in event.target.value. And so we have to update our state by calling this.setState, and we can use the ES6 spread operator to preserve all the values of the other inputs and only modify the value of the input that we care about. Next down here we have the submit handler, and this is also given the event, and it's got to call, if we're going to do an AJAX submit, it's got to call prevent default, so we don't do the HTML submission that like we used to do back in the 90s. And then you can AJAX post off your data to some endpoint. And notice that the data that we're sending off is in this.state.values. We're not looking at the inputs because we know that the values that we have in this.state.values are the values of the form. Finally, we have our render method. And this is where we hook up all of our event listeners and values and things to the React elements that will turn into the DOM when it's rendered. So we hook up our event listeners for onSubmit and onChange to the form and the inputs, respectively. And then we give our value from our state to the value prop. Now, notice the OR here. This is very, very important because with React, if you either don't give a value or you give undefined as the value, React will make what they call an uncontrolled component. And this gives a little bit of autonomy to the DOM input to control its own value and is really only useful if you are using some jQuery widget that needs to be able to modify the value in the DOM. And React strongly recommends that you don't use controlled inputs. You don't use uncontrolled inputs, that you use controlled inputs. So to make it a controlled input, if our username, for example, is undefined, then we need to specify something that's not undefined, so we give it the empty string. And that's our whole form. Pretty easy, huh? So let's look at how the data flows through this form. So when you type into an input, the onChange event fires, which calls our change handler, which calls setState to update the internal state of the React component, which forces a re-render, which renders the input of with the updated value. Now, this happens on every single key press. However, React is extremely fast, and no matter how fast you type on the keyboard, you're really not going to see any lag with this because React is just so fast. However, you might be asking yourself, why would we want to do this? This is an awful lot of work. Why would we want to manage the state ourselves when each DOM input is perfectly happy to keep its own value, and when we click submit, we can go and say, hey, what's your value, and get it back. It would be perfectly happy to do that. And the answer is control. We have complete control over exactly which value the input will have. If we want to manipulate the value as it's being typed, we can, because the value is passing through our code. And most importantly, we have one canonical source of information for the form values that we can trust, that we know that these are the values. Now, the React team realized what a hassle this is, and to maintain the one-way data flow paradigm in your component. And they created something that they called Flux. Now, you don't have to understand exactly what all of this is, but the general gist is that your state is kept in your store, and when something happens in the view, you create an action and you dispatch it through the dispatcher, which calls all the stores, and the stores update themselves, and then the views are subscribed to the store, so they get their update. And the problem was when the React team at Facebook announced this, they didn't give a library that did this. They gave just an architecture spec and said, hey guys, this is a good idea. We're not going to give you our code that does this, but you should look into this. So sort of like back when there were all these DOM manipulation libraries, that's where jQuery eventually won. When this came out, there were dozens and dozens of Flux implementations. I even wrote one myself at one point. But like how jQuery eventually won the DOM manipulation battle, at the moment, this battle has pretty much been won by a library called Redux. So what is Redux? Redux is a general purpose way to manage application state in a predictable way. So let's unpack that. What does that mean? So all of your application state is kept in a single store. It's not the original Flux concept had multiple stores, but Redux just has the one store. The state is read-only. You can't tinker with it. The way that you can update the state is by dispatching actions through the dispatcher. And actions are just plain JavaScript objects. They're not functions. They're just an object with a type and some data. This turns out to be extremely important. And the state is mutated functionally by reducers. A reducer in Redux is just a function that takes the current state, takes the action, and then returns the next state, which it's called a reducer because that's the pattern in functional programming of a reducer. And subscribers are notified to changes only to their specific slice of the state. So what does this get us? Well, it's very easy to reason about your data flow. And it's functional. It's really, really easy to test the reducers that modify your state because there are no side effects. You don't have to mock up a store or anything else. It's just a function that takes a state, an action, and returns a modified state, or doesn't if it's not supposed to. So that's about the easiest thing to write a unit test for. And you know that if something is displayed wrong, then the state is wrong. And you know that if the state is wrong, it's pretty easy to find where it got corrupted because you have this list of actions that got dispatched, and you can see exactly where it went from being okay to being broken. And you can do that with an excellent set of developer tools that Redux has that allow for things like time travel and replaying actions, and it's very, very developer friendly. So we have these two different concepts. We have React Forms, which has one-way data flow. They update their state on every change. They re-render controlled inputs on every change. But maintaining the state is full of boilerplate and disgusting stuff. And then we have Redux, which is one-way data flow. We update the state via dispatched actions. The subscribed components re-render on changes to their slice of the state, And Redux manages all of the broadcast and state changes and the composing of the reducers for us. So, what if we could use the predictable, debuggable, functional, replayable state changes that Redux enables to manage the state in our forms? Well, it turns out that we can. This library called Redux Form does exactly that. It connects our form elements to the Redux state and then provides event listeners to the form elements that dispatch Redux actions, which update the state, which then update our input component. So let's see what that looks like. Remember, this is our simplest possible React for form from before. And now let's see what it looks like in Redux Form. It looks a little bit like this. So let's walk through this. Our submit function doesn't take an event anymore and has to call prevent default. It's just given some values. And Redux Form doesn't care what you do with those values. It doesn't care if you're saving it to local storage or you're using Ajax or whatever. It doesn't matter. And the submit function can potentially return a promise, which Redux Form will use to manage the are you submitting state at the moment for you. Our form component itself now doesn't have any state. It's so simple, in fact, that we can use the stateless function component syntax that React introduced recently. And even simpler still, we can use the fat arrow function shortcut, so we don't even need a return statement. So we're just given some props, and we spit out some React elements that we need. Rather than use our inputs directly, we use this special component that Redux Form provides called field. Now, field is what does all of the work for you. Field connects to the Redux store and injects the value and onChange and onBlur and onFocus props into your input component. The only props that field needs is name, which is the name of your field, and the component, which is what to render. And the component can either be, it can be a string, like one of the default inputs, like input or text area or select, or it can be a custom component that you yourself write. And the rest of the props that you give to field, like type and placeholder here, are just passed along to your input. Field doesn't care about those, it just passes them along. Now, Redux Form provides a special handle submit function that we give to the form on submit that does lots of things for us. There's two different ways to use the handle submit. You can just pass handle submit, in which case Redux Form will look for a on submit prop that was given to your component by its container, and we'll use that for submitting. Or if you want self-contained submission inside your form component, you can give it your own function, and it will use that instead. And this is very useful because sometimes you want a component that knows how to submit itself and you can reuse anywhere and it knows exactly where to submit to. And other times you want a component that you want to reuse in a different way of giving it different places to submit to every time it's submitted. So it's flexible in that way. And the handle submit, apart from canceling the event, performs such tasks as ensuring that all the validation passes before the submit function is called. It maintains the submitting state of if the submission is asynchronous, which it usually is. And it also is in charge of receiving back submission errors and displaying them in the form. So if there's something that can only go wrong on the server, then it can display those. And again, Redux Form does not care what you do with those values. It's all up to you what you do when submit gets called. And lastly, we decorate our component using the Redux Form decorator. We give the Redux Form decorator the name of our form, and this is going to be used as the key for our form data in the Redux store. So it needs to be unique to this form. And the Redux Form function here gives you back a decorator, which you can use to decorate your component. And what that does is it creates what's called a higher order component that wraps your form component and can provide it props and functionality and things. And that's it. Our form is complete. We have React controlled components, and every change, every key press dispatches an action, which changes not only the value of that field in the Redux store, but potentially other states, such as whether the form is dirty or valid or invalid. And all that is managed for you by Redux and Redux Form. So let's do a quick recap of where we've been here. HTML forms, when they were first introduced, required all server rendering and processing. And when you came back with errors, you had to re-download the whole HTML page. Then we got jQuery and Ajax, and that helped by being able to submit in the background, but the state was all entirely still in the DOM inputs. And then we got TwoWay binding with Angular and Ember that provided sort of a hybrid solution where we were starting to pull the form state out of the inputs and into the JavaScript. And then React introduced controlled inputs that took all of the power away from the DOM and kept the data solely in JavaScript. But the React controlled inputs required a bunch of updating boilerplate, which we don't want to have to write on every single form. However, Redux is this library that is excellent in managing state via functional reducers and developer-friendly replayable actions. And finally, Redux Form marries Redux to the React controlled inputs to manage all of your form state in Redux. And this allows for very fast form development and easy debugging. So as you've seen, we've taken the form state from the DOM and then pulled it up a little bit higher and pulled up a little bit higher, and now it's just all up in the application state. It's not even in our component. So just how fast is the development on this? Well, I'm about to attempt some live coding. So wish me luck, everyone. So let me mirror our displays. Okay. So here we have pretty much the simplest possible React component. It's just a function and returns a div and an h1, and it's rendered over here. So let's build a form. So first we need a form tag and then some inputs. Oops, not use the American spelling. And we'll call this first name. And so here you would go and you'd put your input, but because we're using Redux Form, that needs to be a field. Import. So we're going to put Redux Form and field from Redux Form. And so this needs to be field name, first name. Component for now can just be input. So let's see what this happens, what this gives us over here. We did not use the Redux Form yet. So we have to decorate our component here, and that looks like this. Redux Form. Form equals, call this live form. And we use that to decorate. So over here, we have an input. And here's our Redux developer tools. And you'll notice that, and expect just what we want, that when we give focus to the field, we get this focus action over here. And when we take away the focus, it blurs again. And when we start typing in here, we get one change event for every single key that I pressed. And we can see down here our state. Oops, yeah, state. Our form is our state slice for all of our Redux forms. And this is our live form. And down here we have our values. And as we type in here, you notice that our values are changing in real time down there. Okay, so this is sort of boring, so let's add some more fields. We'll add last name and email. And we'll make this last name and email. And let's go ahead and put some placeholders on here. And on email, we can say type equals email. So for certain browsers, like mobile browsers, it'll give you a slightly different keyboard. Last name. Here is placeholder. All right, let's see what this looks like over here. Okay, we got our extra fields, and notice that we lost our form value here. This is because this is being reloaded with React Hot Loader, and at the moment, when React Hot Loader reloads your components, it unmounts the previous ones and mounts the new one. And however, I think this is going to be fixed either this week or next week. It's under development. And Redux Form, by default, when your form gets unmounted to save memory, it blows away all that form state in Redux. So for the purposes of this demonstration, and in some valid use cases, we can set this destroy on unmount to false, and now that won't happen to us anymore. So we need a submit button, I think. We've got our submit button. And now when we type something in here and we click submit, oh, well, it's using the old HTML way of submitting our form. So we don't want that. We need to actually add our onSubmit here on the form. So as you may recall, Redux Form provides us this handle submit function. And so we can say onSubmit, handle submit, but what are we going to do with it? I actually have a function called show results. And that is literally just, it's going to wait a second to simulate server latency and then alert our values. So we give that here to handle submit, show results. So now over here, when we type in something and we click submit, it waits a second and alerts our results. However, we didn't fill out email here, and we think we want that to be required. So we need to do some validation. So the way you do that is you write a validation function. And that just looks like it's just a function that takes values and returns some errors. And the error object needs to be in the same exact shape as your values were. So if I've got values.firstname, then if there's an error with that, it needs to be errors.firstname. So let's do some of that. If we don't have values.firstname, then errors.firstname equals required. And let's go and do that for our other ones. Last name and email. So now we have validation. Oh, well, no, we don't have validation yet. So the cool thing about React Hot Loader is that it's will run your, it can be configured to run your code through ESLint. And so here we found a bug as we were developing, and that was that we didn't give validate to Redux Form over here. So now we're validating our values, and I can prove that to you because in our state, we now have sync errors. So email is required. But notice that as things change, so now we have last name required, but as I type something in here, watch what happens, it goes away. But we're not displaying the errors, so that needs to be remedied. So the errors are given to us in this component prop. The component that we give there is given all of our metadata for our field, including errors. So we can't just use the regular vanilla input here. We need to write our own component. So let's do that. We'll call it render input, and it takes a field, and it returns. Oops. We can just have it return this whole div here. So rather than field here, we will say this is our input. And all the props that our input needs are in, should be field, are in field.input, and we can destructure that with the React and ES6 way of destructuring props into your component. So now we have something that will render, this will render only first name. So here we can just use field.input.placeholder for our label. So now our input becomes field name equals first name component. Rather than input as before, we use render input, and our placeholder equals first name. And so that gets rid of all of those 4 lines, and we can do this for our other stuff. Oops. And this is email and last name. And we can put our type here. Okay, so now we can get rid of all of this stuff. So now, over here, we have a parsing error. Let's see, line 21. Very good. Okay, so see how that caught that immediately? So here, we still don't have our errors because we haven't displayed them yet. So let's do that. Let's wrap our little input here in a div. And so if our field has an error, then we will print out a span with field.error. So now what do we have? All right, we have our required error on email. So if I refresh, you'll notice it's a little bit strange because these are all required and we're already yelling at the user that they need to fill these out. So that's not very polite. So what we can do is we can say if the field has an error and the field has been touched, then display the error. So what touched means is when you focus on an input and then leave the input, it's marked as touched. And that is the recommended time to display an error because you want to give the user the benefit of the doubt that they know how to fill out a form. But if they make a mistake, as soon as they make the mistake and go out to the next input, we need to say, hey, come back here. Your other option is to use visited. And that is similar, but that becomes true as soon as you go into the form field. But that's still a little bit obnoxious, so we're not going to do that. But if you have a use case for that, you can. All right, so now we have our form validation, and we can fill out our form. Notice, this is one thing, that when you click submit, handle submit, if the validation is not passing, it will mark all your fields as touched so that the user knows what they've done wrong. So notice how the errors go away as I fill it out and I put something in here. but that's not a valid email address. So let's add a validation rule for email address. You can write your own, but it's not recommended. There are many such libraries. So if we have an email and it's not an email, values.email, then we say errors.email equals invalid email address. So we go back over here, and notice just immediately it's reloaded all of our validation and is telling us that this is an invalid email address. So as soon as it becomes a valid email address, we're good, and we can submit our form. Okay, so now let's do something a little bit more complicated. Let's add an array of phone numbers, for example, to this form. So the way you do that is with a component called field array. And it's similar to field. Field array name, phones, component, and we're going to have to write our own component here. So we're going to say render phones. So let's write that component. Render phones. So this takes a couple different props, but the ones we really care about is fields. And because this is going to be a list, let's make it a UL. And I think the first item should be a button to add new phones. So let's make that. And we'll call it add phone. And what it needs to do on click is call fields.push. Now, you could pass an initial value, but we just want to have an empty field for now. Now, this fields object is array-like. It's not really an array, but it has things like push and pop and shift and unshift and length and for each and things like that. So you can sort of imagine that it's an array. So now we need to print out our phone fields. So we will do fields.map, and this will give us a field and an index. And here, this is going to be an li, and React, for reasons I won't go into right now, really, if you're outputting an array, really likes you to pass a key there, and a unique key. And here, we have to make a field, and our name is just what we've been given here in our field. That's a string, and it's going to be something like phones of 0, for example. And for our component, we can just go ahead and reuse our render input from before. So if there were an error, it would get displayed properly here. So let's see what that looks like. Hey, we have an add phone button, and when we click it, we get a field that does not have a label because we did not put placeholder here. Placeholder. So now we have a placeholder there, and we can add as many as we want, but that placeholder could be improved upon. So let's do something like phone number index +1. Let's do something like that. So now they have nice numbers. So we can keep adding phones, and as we type in here, well, actually, the next thing we need is probably a way to remove phones, because that makes sense. So button type, button, and this needs to do, as you might have been able to guess without even looking at the docs, fields of remove of index. And I've got a style, so I don't need any text in there. So now we have these remove buttons over here, and as I click on them, you can see that they get removed. Okay, so maybe we don't want so many phones, so let's add a validation rule to prevent adding so many phones. So up here in our validate, we can say if values.phones. If the length is greater than 3, then we can say errors.phones. Now, this is a little bit tricky with errors for whole arrays, because you have to be able to also give back errors for the individual fields in there. And if we were doing that, then it would be the error for the first phone would be in here. But so in order to give an error for the whole array, we have to use a special key, phones.error_error. So too many phones. We'll yell at them. So now, if we display our error down here, so if fields.error, then we'll do an li class name error, if we can spell it. And this is going to be fields error. So now we should have an error down here. And when we go down below 4 phones, the error goes away. So let's see, what else can we do? What if we want to disable the submit button when your form is invalid? Well, that's pretty easy. Redux Form injects something called an invalid prop. And let's go ahead and do submitting while we're at it too. So down here on our submit button, we can say disabled when invalid or submitting. So now, when we have an invalid, when there's a validation error, we can't submit anymore. So this is good, except we can just type whatever we want into phones here. So it'd be nice if we could make that more into a phone number. And we can do that with what's called normalizing. And that is, you can give it a function that it will pass the value through as it's updating. So let's do that right quick. Normalize phone from normalize phone. That's not too exciting of a method, but you'll see what it does. So then down here on our phone field, we can say normalize phone. And now, let's refresh here. So now when we add a phone, I can't type any letters in here, but when I type numbers, it gets nicely formatted into our phone numbers format, and I can't type anymore. So just to reiterate how simple normalizing is, let's create another field. We'll call it promo code, for example, and we'll reuse our render input and placeholder promo code. And let's say that we only give out promo codes to our customers that are all uppercase. So let's write a very trivial normalizer that takes a value and returns value.to uppercase. And then down here, for our promo code, we can say normalizer equals upper. So automatically we got our promo code thing here, and whenever I type that did not work because I did normalize. So now when I type into here, I only get uppercase characters. So this is a pretty simple example of a fairly complex form that had very good developer experience when creating it. And so let's watch what happens when I fill out the whole form. So watch over here, watch all the actions happen. So we get an error message, and we add a phone, and we'll add another phone, and we'll add a promo code, and we click submit, and we get our data nicely formatted. Our phones are in an array of strings. Now, watch this. Down here, yep. So, because this is Redux Form and it's all replayable, you can go back and forward, and I can even replay this as it was typed, so we can see exactly what was happening. This is replaying all of our actions because your Redux state is only the actions that you gave it. It's only, it's only the sum of your history. So that's pretty cool, if you ask me. So now let's go back to presentation for a moment. You are not here, you are here. And play. So let me talk briefly about some stats about Redux Form. Redux Form is not even a year old yet. The very first commit was on July 31st, 2015, less than a year ago. And it's got over 2,900 stars on GitHub. I checked this morning and it's like 2,950 now. Version 6 is a complete rewrite. I started a couple months ago, and I started from nothing, and I built the whole exact same functionality back to optimize for speed, because version 5 and before, whenever a field value changed, it would re-render your entire form. And that was fine for login forms or with a form the size of the one I just made. But there are people using Redux Form that have huge CRM applications with 50 fields on the page at a time. And there was a little bit of lag re-rendering everything the whole time. But with version 6, it only now re-renders the field that has changed, which is a huge speed improvement. Version 6 will be released later this month. It's at a very late stage alpha at the moment, and there are already people using it in production. And if you're going to start using Redux Form, don't look at version 5, start with version 6. It's widely used in production apps all around the globe. And another thing about version 6 is version 6 was built with an ambivalence to the structure of your data in your Redux store. So Redux has the ability to, normally your store values are just JavaScript objects inside your store, but you can use other libraries like Immutable.js, for example, which has a lot of benefits. And with Redux Form, it works immediately with Immutable.js stores just out of the box, which was a very requested feature. And it works with React Native even. I know of several production mobile apps that have shipped into the App Store who are maintaining their state in their form state using Redux Form. And it's been growing in popularity month over month since its original release last year. And it really is the go-to standard for managing forms in Redux. And just in the last 30 days, it's already had 145,000 downloads. So the trend seems to be continuing. So let me talk briefly about what the future looks like for web forms. I think that we've moved in the right direction, keeping the values, managing the state of your form values out of the DOM components. There are still little bits of things like where your cursor position is and your selection in the form that can't really be done yet, but React, if it had its way, your inputs would just be display only with feeding back events and have no state whatsoever. Declarative UI, I think, is here to stay. All the other frameworks are migrating to it because they saw the power that it has with React. And I also think that client-side application-wide state management via actions and a functional approach is here to stay. So at the moment, the current best way to have declarative UI is React, And the current best way to have client-side application-wide state management is Redux. And for forms, we're always going to need some glue to put those two together. And at the moment, Redux Form is the answer. But no matter what succeeds these different libraries, maybe in 5 years we're using something that isn't React, and maybe we're using something that isn't Redux, and maybe we're using something that isn't Redux Form. But I think this structure is going to be the way forward. So thank you very much. I hope you try Redux Form.
Sure. All right.
Any questions?
We'll open up to some questions. Any questions, guys? Just press the button.
Hey.
Hi.
If you got, say, maybe an application like Trello where you have a bunch of cards,
right?
How do you handle it if you need to have multiple forms that are live on the screen at once? Like, is there a convention for naming them or something so that each one has its own set of state?
Oh, as long as the names are different, then there will be different forms. You can have as many forms as you want on the page.
Okay.
And because of the way Redux works to connect only, like the data doesn't flow all the way down from the top of the page. The data is connected to your component down, your leaf component. There should be no problem having as many forms as you want on the page.
And there's no opinionated way for Redux Forms to do it. It's just give it a name you want that makes sense.
A name that you
It's
want.
just
and
an isolated form.
in fact, a common use case is you have a list of records, and you want to click edit on one of the records, and it switches to inputs, right? And then you want to, if you click edit on another record, then that can switch to inputs too. So you've got lots of forms potentially on the page at a time. And as long as they're unique, I would call it widgets, bracket, index, for each of your things. But as long as they're unique, it doesn't really matter.
Thanks.
Oops. All right. Any other questions? All good.
Is anyone here using Redux Form at the moment? Good. Anyone using version 6? Okay.
I have a question here. So cursor position is not preserved right now. Like the input will be re-rendered every time. So if we are changing the first 2 characters after typing the full input.
I'm sorry, the input will be re-rendered.
Re-rendered, right? Every time it's key up.
Every time it changes.
So the cursor position will be retained in the same character position, or it will be at the end?
The character position.
Cursor.
Yes. Yes, although I don't know that that's absolutely guaranteed, but I've never seen it go wrong. It's because it's just so fast that it's already re-rendered by the time you're going to press the next key. So, but yes, like for example, that's one thing that React does is even if you've moved the cursor to the middle and you're typing in the middle, it stays there. React handles that.
Cool.
Great, thank you. Hold on, let's get a mic to you, please. I was wondering why you've not asked a question for so long.
Yeah, how does unit testing, functional testing happen? Do you have any demo there?
How you would test...
Unit tests.
Right.
Not test automation.
Well, Redux Form has its own internal unit tests, which are a pretty decent example of how to render a Redux Form. And what you can do is you can request from test utils the component of one of your inputs, and you can call onChange on it and see and update the values that way. Does that answer your question?
Is there any sample for that?
Sample. No, I don't have an example to show you right now. I mean, the best example is the tests in Redux Form itself, because there are many, many, many tests that generate a form in like JS DOM and then do stuff with it to make sure that it works properly. So I would recommend that you look in the repo for Redux Form.
Next question, maybe? So-
Hello. In version 6, about the APIs, it changed quite a bit, Erik?
No, there's a detailed migration guide. Obviously, I tried to make it change as little as possible, but what happened is there's an inversion of control, whereas with 5 and before, it was the form component that had all the control over each input, and now because you need this field component to connect all of your inputs, you have to. There's a little bit of trickery, like having a special component to render. Like before, your big form component had all of the errors for all the fields, and you could, rather than having to do what I did with having a separate render input to render the errors, you could just spit out the error next to the input. But because of that, there's a little bit. Once you get used to it, it's fine. But there's a little bit of a switch you have to flip in your brain and to reason about it. But I've migrated several things, and I know other people that have migrated, and it's fairly easy. Because really, even in version 5, if you were doing it properly with an in production app, you probably already had a special component that rendered your input and your errors and stuff already that you were replicating around your application. So if you've already got that, then it's almost no work at all.
Hold on, grab a mic, please. Grab a mic, please.
His question is, how would you go about debouncing? Well, I mean, it's debouncing for what purpose?
Say I want to make network requests, but only after user has stopped typing for 200 ms.
Okay. Well, you can, when you're giving the on change. Okay, so.
But that would stop the change input action from.
You can override the on change that Redux Form provides for you to give to your input. So you can say you can give it a different on change that as long as you also call the Redux Form, the on change that Redux Form gives you, it'll still end up in the store and it'll work. And then you can do whatever you want when that happens. I don't know if that makes sense. I could show you with some code, but.
My concern is that usually when we have the value from the store, when you debounce that, the value won't change until user has when the like.
That's
when
because
you
you're not.
debounce it,
That's because you're not calling the on change that Redux Form gives you, which handles the dispatching of the change action. As long as you're doing that, the value is just going to change when you type.
Okay, I'll see.
Okay, we can talk about it.
All good.
Thank you.
All right.
Any more questions? Is there a question? Okay, cool.
Cool.
Thanks a lot, Erik.
Thank you.
Audio